And we finally come to the end of this sermon series on wisdom called Built to Last, Living Your Life for Excellence and Change. And we've looked at some major themes in the wisdom literature of the Bible, looking at Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Lamentations, and seeing how these are all really ancient lab reports from the scientific discipline of wisdom. It's the same scientific discipline that the Magi, carrying their treasure chests and their banner on the wall there, they were experts in this ancient discipline of science. You can go back and watch previous sermons on our website, on our YouTube channel. But today we look at planning. And I was interested to look at the Magi and to be reading about them and to see that when Alexander the Great invaded Persia and conquered Persia, he found the Magi, the same group of scientists who visited the baby Jesus, were guarding this tomb. This is called the tomb of Cyrus the Great. He was one of the great kings of Persia, and it was so important that he actually had the whole scholarly guild of Magi all keeping watch over night and day. And Alexander the Great actually puts the Magi on trial for doing a bad job because grave robbers had broken in and had looted much of Cyrus's remains. But this is a wonderful example of ancient stone architecture. That if you want to build tall, you've got to build wide. You think about a pyramid or a tomb like this with a big fat bottom and then skinnier layers as you go up higher and higher. That's because of the incredible weight, the incredible compressive force from gravity pulling down on those heavy stones. Ancient buildings, although they had mortar, it was not what held buildings together. There are stones that were set 1,000 years ago in castle walls in Europe that have still not yet dried. The ancient formula for mortar was not very adhesive. It was mostly just to keep the stones nice and even, but it could take 1,000 years for the mortar to truly dry. Instead, what held ancient stone buildings together was the stones themselves, the precise cuts all fitting together in a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. An incredible tribute to the planning required from ancient architects, every stone having a place to hold the incredible weight. This is what many ancient buildings looked like. Now, this is great if you're going to be a dead guy. You don't need a lot of interior square footage if you're dead. Just one little room on top of a big pile of rocks will do. But if you want to have a congregation or an assembly of any variety, just like in Huntsville, Alabama, we like interior square footage. Now, how to get that interior square space was an engineering feat in and of itself. What the Romans worked out, among others, was a series of arches that had round tops, and that would give you a little bit of interior space. You were still very restricted in how high and tall you could make a building, and certainly in how big the windows could be, because a window would weaken a wall, and you don't want weak walls when you've got big stone roofs. So all of this begins to change about 1,000 years ago in an abbey in a suburb to the north of Paris called Saint-Denis. And in the 1100s at Saint-Denis, a brilliant architect creates an amazing innovation, and I've got it for you here on the next slide. This is Saint-Denis, totally different from Cyrus's tomb. Soaring vaulted ceilings going straight up without needing wide columns as a base. One thing you will notice is the windows bringing in lots of light without weakening the structure. It was almost as if they had brought heaven to earth. Now, what you will see, different from a Roman arch, is a pointed arch. People walked in, and the critics immediately panned it. They said that this was disgraceful modern architecture, a total travesty of Western civilization, completely out of step of our Roman forebears who built entire empires, thank you very much, with the round arch. So why on earth would we want to change it with these unsightly, skinny pillars? They hated it so much they said, this is not French architecture. This is clearly German architecture. Gothic, after the German tribe of the Goths, who came and, yes, sacked the Roman Empire. And yet, this began to catch on. Architect after architect began using the principles developed at Saint-Denis for what became almost like a skyscraper race in Manhattan. Last week we looked at the I-beam in steel and how that made possible huge, tall skyscrapers in Manhattan. And they began to compete with each other to see who could build the tallest skyscraper. In medieval 12th century and 13th century France, the bishops and the abbots began to compete who could make the tallest and grandest cathedral using the new Gothic architecture. And the key behind this is the idea of stress lines. Now you see these two vectors on each of the arches, and it shows you the vertical and horizontal components of those forces. You can see that with a round Roman arch, the force is primarily directed horizontally, sideways. And that has the effect, the compressive effect, of ripping apart the pillars so that the roof will cave in unless you've got a big pyramid-like structure or very, very thick columns. Contrast that with the pointed arch, which redirects more of the force into the vertical component of the vector. More of the force traveling straight down the pillars and into the earth where it's absorbed. You're still not out of the woods yet, though. You can see it's not perfectly straight down. There's still some sideways motion acting against the pressure of the columns. This required another evolution to the plan, creating a support that would intersect the column right at that red line, right at the end of the triangle, at the end of the stress line. And these became known as flying buttresses. You can see it's just a spindly little support that shoots over, and there's one stone from that flying buttress that is completely flush against the exact point of the stress line. It took amazing planning, like building a huge multi-million-dollar house of cards. Because remember, the mortar is not super glue. It's just a suggestion, like the frosting on a cake made out of stone. Really, each of these stones must be cut absolutely precisely and slotted in at the perfect angle for the entire structure to hold. It's a beautiful picture of wise planning that takes us into our scripture passage in Proverbs 8, where we see God acting as a great architect, using the tools and the instruments of a master architect to construct the world using the principles of wisdom and ancient science. This song in the book of Proverbs, chapter 8, is really written as a song in the point of view of science itself. So you can hear, if science was in a Broadway musical, this is what she would sing. And so we begin in Proverbs 8, starting with verse 22. The Lord brought me forth, me, wisdom, as the first of his works, before his deeds of old. I was formed long ages ago, at the very beginning, when the world came to be. When there were no watery depths, I was given birth. When there were no springs overflowing with water, before the mountains were settled in place, before the hills, I was given birth. Before he made the world or its fields or any of the dust of the earth. I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep, when he gave the sea its boundaries so the waters would not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was constantly at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in the whole world and delighting in mankind. Now then, my children, listen to me. Blessed are those who keep my ways. Listen to my instruction and be wise. Do not disregard it. Blessed are those who listen to me, watching daily at my doors, waiting at my doorway. For those who find me find life and receive favor from the Lord. But those who fail to find me harm themselves. All who hate me love death. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A powerful song sung by the character of science, of wisdom. If you read this same passage in Latin just a few verses back, wisdom says that I live in the same house as intelligence and science. Begins by saying, wisdom saying, I'm calling out in the city street. I'm at the major intersection of 565 and 65. You cannot miss me. The only way you can miss me and can't hear my cries out to you to be wise is if you completely shut your eyes. And those who do that have a death wish. It's powerful to see the image of God as the master architect. Now, unlike what the Roman Stoics would have believed, God is not underneath wisdom, as if wisdom is some law that's governing God, but instead, before he creates anything else, God creates a plan. And the name of that plan is wisdom. In verse 22, it says that the Lord brought me wisdom forth as the first of his works. That's actually the Hebrew word derek, derekim, which means not works, but ways, paths. We can think of that as God's plan. The roadmap that he was going to use to make all creation was his first item of business. And then it says that he made this roadmap, these derekim, ahead of, prior to his nephilim, his deeds. That is an actual action that you bring into concreteness. So we see that the plans of the Lord precede his actions. It's powerful then to see at the end of this passage where wisdom sings out, now then, my children, listen to me, and blessed are those who keep my ways, my roadmap, my derekim. Just like publishing a lab report in a scientific journal. You can't get it in there just because you think it's a good idea. You have to get it peer-reviewed by other scientists who try to reproduce your same results under similar conditions in a different laboratory. And only then is it made public. In the same way, wisdom is telling us God has designed this world according to his plan, and he has made it public. It's not secret. Even though it's worth more than buried treasure, it is out in the open for you to grasp and to make a part of your plans. Sometimes it's good to know how something's important when you see when it doesn't work, when our plans fail. And a good example of that would be the great cathedral at Amiens. We've got a picture of that here next. In the great race to the heavens, to make the most celestial cathedral in the kingdom, Amiens won the blue ribbon. By the end of the 13th century, the architect had created the tallest, loftiest, grandest, widest cathedral with the biggest windows and fewest supports. An architectural marvel. The architect didn't just want to follow science and math. He wanted to follow the wisdom of the Bible. And so he created this central interior area at the choir to be the dimensions of Noah's Ark, a 50 by 50 square, big enough to carry all of creation by God's sovereign hand through the waters of darkness and death unto salvation. A beautiful metaphor for those worshiping in the space. When deciding how tall to make the cathedral, he decided to make it as tall as the kingdom of heaven. In the book of Revelation, when it tells us that the New Jerusalem will come down on earth and it will be 144 cubits tall. This architect made his cathedral 144 Roman feet tall, the same numerical dimensions as heaven itself. It was truly an achievement to end all achievements, until a generation later, when worshipers began to notice cracks appearing around that Noah's Ark space. The huge amount of square footage had come at a terrible cost when a fresh architect was brought in and realized that the flying buttresses were not in the proper place. Rather than intersecting at the lines of tension, they were above that. The stones need to be connecting at the exact point of tension, and instead they were several yards up above, meaning that an incredible amount of compressive force was going horizontally in these 144-foot columns, making them kind of like a case of scoliosis. Something had to be done. And what emerged was a brilliant new plan. Perhaps the first use of metal on a large scale as a structural material. An iron foundry was formed nearby, and they began to construct a giant iron chain that was then put red hot all the way around the perimeter. You can see this kind of bumpy line towards the top of those columns right above the archway. That is a big medieval iron chain that functions like a pair of Spanx. Now, if you don't know what Spanx are, this is a kind of shapewear that uses the opposite force of compression, tension. And we've talked about how those two forces need to be in equilibrium for a bridge to hold up. We talked about the first week. And I told you the second week that I am exactly one Teddy bigger than I was a year ago. My baby Teddy is 13 pounds, and I am also 13 pounds extra than I was a year ago. That's the unit of measurement, not cubits, but Teddies that you can measure me by. And if I didn't want to do my own advice and do the discipline of a diet, I could buy a pair of Spanx, and you wouldn't even notice my bulge under this robe. This would just be a very svelte-looking pastor in front of you. But it works exactly the same. The bulge that was appearing in the columns was compressed by a corset of iron, red hot, that then cooled and got even smaller, so that for 1,000 years, this chain has been literally holding the greatest cathedral on earth up. The thing about life is that we can't do it over. We can only do it differently. We can't change our past, but we can change our plans. There are many things in my life that I wish I had done differently, but it's gone. The opportunity has passed me. The only thing I can do today is look at where I am, for all my faults, for all my strengths, and make a fresh plan for my future. If you're trying to make a plan yourself, whether it's for an organization or you individually for a goal you have, a great tool is something I learned in business school called SWOT analysis, and I've got that here. And what it does is it looks at pros and cons that are internal to yourself, things that are your own fault, for better or for worse. And we call those strengths or weaknesses. And then also things that are external to yourself, the market, the weather. And we call those opportunities or threats. And I think about a moment in my life when I had to make a fresh plan. Now, many of y'all know that I went to a very fancy and hippie school in which grades were really no big deal, man. Just relax, chill. And I embraced that and studied whatever I pleased. I learned how to read German poetry. I learned about medieval architecture. I learned about lots of economic theory. The only thing I didn't learn about was economic reality. And sadly for me, there was a threat on my horizon, which was graduation. And what was my plan, anyhow? Well, I figured out that I would avoid flipping burgers by going to graduate school, as many people do. And I found out there was a graduate school that would ignore my grades from undergraduate, mercifully, as long as I scored a 90% or higher on the nationwide business school entrance exam. So I said to myself, listen, this is going to be a cinch. I can read German poetry, check. I know about medieval architecture, check. And I know about the economic theory of John Maynard Keynes, check. This will be a cinch. I'm going to go in and take this exam. So I sat down for this nationally administered exam, and I scored a 50%. Probably the only exam I actually needed to pass in my entire college career, and I worse than failed. I had to do a deep analysis of myself. Graduate school looked like it was not going to happen for me. I was going to be singing German poetry all the way to my burger grill. So I had to do some analysis. Strengths. I know German poetry, medieval architecture, and the economic theory of John Maynard Keynes. Strengths. Weaknesses. When it comes to middle school level math, I am slow and wrong. And it turns out the business school examination doesn't look kindly on that, so that's a weakness. Opportunities. If I score 90% on this exam, University of Florida will allow me to enter as a student. Threat. Graduation day. The clock is ticking. So I had to create a new plan. I realized that I was both slow and dumb. And to change that, what I did is I took the number of questions that were going to be administered in the exam, and then I divided by the time that was available for each question, and then I bought every single practice book that had ever been published for this exam, and I timed myself. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questions, only giving myself about 30 seconds per question. If I couldn't answer it, it was wrong. And I continued to take questions until I could shore up my weaknesses of being slow and stupid. Eventually, I became quick and I relearned middle school math, perhaps for the first time. That was a good example of how planning helped me reach my goal of being a lifelong banker. We saw how that worked out. We can't change our past, but we can change our plans. And when we do, it's important to use wisdom. The books of wisdom in the Bible, these lab reports that we've looked at, and the themes of resilience, of discipline, of change and planning, are studies in contrast, compression and tension, fools and wise people, how to live your life this year in 2020 and the decade of the 2020s according to the same wisdom that is crying out to you from the interstate, the same wisdom that God himself used before the dust of the earth was formed, before he set creation in motion as the greatest cathedral ever created. And yet, what Dr. Hunsicker is going to preach about in February is that the gospel is not wise. The gospel is foolish. Because we are fools. There is no pair of Spanx that can hide your sin. There is no iron chain that can somehow shore up the mistakes of my past or yours. For that, we need something that's very unwise, which is God himself, coming not to live, but to die. To die for people who don't deserve it. To die for people who have and will continue to betray him. Not because it's wise, but because he loves you. The love of God is more powerful than wisdom. It is more powerful than your past. It is more hopeful than your future. So as we come together this year, this decade, let us worship the God who was foolish enough to save you and save me, to build us a firm foundation this day and forever. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.